Working my way through some Wargaming mailbag here. Proxies in Wargaming. What are they? How do they affect the game? And yes or no, because sometimes with regard to proxies, it's very, very clear cut. And other times, not so straightforward. So there's this idea. We're doing this miniature wargaming thing, right? We're stepping outside of space and time. We're collecting these miniatures. We're building them, terrain, narrative. We're trying to immerse ourselves in a 3D world. We're trying to immerse ourselves in this tabletop, making decisions as a commander, as a general, as a mech warrior, as a pilot. This idea where there are moments in the game where the rules melt away and the dice disappear. And in that moment, you are in the game. That is what we're trying to do and come together as wargaming friends to make that possible. Proxies are where you take a miniature and it represents something else, something other than depicted. The reason for this could be you want to try out some different models. You have a different unit. Perhaps the battle calls for something that you don't have in your collection and you really want to try it out. So you say, I'm going to take these models and it's going to be this. Essentially, a proxy is, this is the model, but it represents something else. Now, where do we kind of see this? Because there's a fine line between models with different war gear or unit setups. And to sidebar that for a moment, what that means in examples, if you're playing Warhammer 40,000, although I heard this is changing because GW is not making enough money, when you have a unit in Warhammer 40,000, that's a sci-fi based miniature game, everything is WYSIWYG. What this means is the weapons that the units have, or the weapons on the tanks, that's what they physically represent in the game. And in some mass scale, mass combat games, that's important because I need to be able to look at the models within that universe narrative and know these are the anti-tank units, these are the anti-infantry, these are the monstrous creatures. That's important. Then you see games like BattleTech where you have the mechs and there's primary configurations for the miniatures, but then there are all of these variants, and the variant mechs based on the mech itself swap different weapons, change different weapons. In BattleTech, what you see is what you get isn't always enforced or isn't necessary. It's just that you know, hey, this is a Marauder, this type of mech, and instead of PPCs, it has large lasers, and it has more armor, it has this, it has that. There are variants. Variants really aren't true proxies. Proxies are where I take a certain type of tank, if I'm playing historicals, and I say, okay, this is a Panzer III tank. I have 3 of them, but actually I want to try them out as Tigers. So I'm going to play it as a Tiger tank. Now, you could say, what's the big deal with that, right? This is where we kind of get into the system. First of all, it depends on the person you're playing with. Are they okay with that? Does it kill the immersion? Possibly. Depends on the proxy that we're talking about. Could it possibly change the game, the effects of the game? Possibly. Depends on if the other player and yourself with what you're trying to recreate, how important is that? The example I give, Chain of Command, historicals, World War II, late war, putting down 3 Panzer IIIs and putting down Tiger tanks. A Tiger tank is much, much bigger. Putting down a Panther, much, much bigger than a Panzer III, or worse if I have Panzer IIs and Panzer Is. I don't know enough historically if late war there was any of those 1s and 2s left. I'm sure there were 3s left. But physically in the game, when you have a game that line of sight is everything, obscurity is everything, blocking is everything, the terrain interacts, literally having a tank half the size of another tank, that could make a significant difference. I mean, imagine a war game also where you've got giant battle robots and you proxy one for a smaller one, or you just put a counter on the table and you say, well, here's a counter and I want to utilize that. So it can kind of mess with the narrative. Now, where else do you see proxies? I see a lot of proxies and I've used them. I've used them competitively. What I mean by that is when I'm trying out new lists, when I'm with my friends and we were big in the X-Wing tournament scene, I would take bases and we'd just mark them as a certain type of ship, because before I go out and buy 10 of them and integrate them into my list, I want to see how they play. But that was almost like a discovery toolkit. Yes, we were doing this wargaming thing, but it was more about let's try out new units. Or likewise, when we were playing 40K competitively and GW would drop new stuff, drop a new decks, we know we're going to face it. So we would put together army lists to possibly face and test our own armies against. So we had a whole proxy machine printing out tokens and printing out cardboard modifications to play these armies. But that's a toolkit. That was like weightlifting. That was like going for a run. That was like preparing for a battle. That wasn't a narrative game. So there are times where maybe you want to try out or just try out a new army, right? I want to play a Raven Wing army. And before I go out and do that, let me just make up proxies and see how the game plays and see how I like it. So we tend to see a lot of proxies in that direction. I want to try something out. I'm prepping for a tournament. I wonder how a unit works. But the game itself, especially if it's tournament-based, once you're in there are no proxies because it's not really fair. You need to know what you're possibly or potentially going up against. Historical wargaming. I really don't see many proxies there. I don't. It's the nature of what you're trying to do. We're playing DBA, DBN. I've got my Romans. I've got my Napoleonics. Forget about unpainted. Like I catch stuff where like if my Romans aren't painted correctly, based on the time period and down to the legion, like the banner has to be correct. And I get it. That's what we're trying to do with historicals. Historicals are trying to get so laser intense focused. I was going to say focusized, if that's a word, where you are literally recreating a battle and asking yourself, if I was in command, what would I have done? How would the battle have changed or not changed? So that's a completely different thing. But more casual type war games, you might see proxies from time to time. You might see a player say, hey, I'm working on this unit and I want to maybe purchase another one and try it. Do you think I can put down my tank here and say it's a different tank? I'm okay with that usually, right? I've played a lot of war games. I will continue to play a lot of war games. If you want to try something out, let's try it out. But there are certain times and certain places where proxies are okay and proxies are not okay.